actual fact, what you saw was a part of the brutality. It was even graver than what we witnessed on the film. For example, you saw at the beginning the young man tied to the front of the Jeep or whatever it was. That was a common practice. This thing about human shields, for example. You saw people being shot for having weapons in the house. In actual fact, in some villages, they literally decimated the population. They took one man in every 10, took them out of the village and shot them. On other occasions, they made them run the gauntlet and stabbed them with bayonets, carried out sexual assaults when they imprisoned them and so on. So in fact, that wasn't depicted in the film, and I can understand why that was the case. But the reality of what was happening 36 to 39 was absolutely brutal. Wingate set up these special night squads, and actually, it was deliberately organized to terrorize, incorporated, as was, again, just a word in passing that you may not have picked up, but sections of the Zionist paramilitary were also involved, like the Irgun and Haganah and these other people. So when you talk about, for example, something like 40 to 50,000 British troops there, on top of that, there was 10,000 members of the Haganah, which was a paramilitary Zionist organization. And they were part of the scene. And a lot of this links very much into a whole series of things you see from British imperialism. So, for example, Balfour himself, just by way of anecdote, Balfour himself was Secretary of State in Ireland in the 1880s, 1890s, and was called Bloody Balfour for the way in which he treated people seeking Irish unity. On top of that, during the Irish War of Independence and the 1916 uprising, and then particularly in the War of Independence, the early 20s, the British employed what were called by the Irish the Black and Tans. They were paramilitaries who were recruited, who, because of the shortage of uniforms at the time, they wore a blue tunic and brown trousers. They'd come out of the army. And something like 300 to 400 or 500 of them actually went to serve in Palestine as well. And they had employed those tactics in Ireland against Republicans, against those fighting for Irish independence. They burnt down houses. They carried out these kind of reprisals that you saw in this film. So there was a continuity about the way in which imperialism behaved. And that was very, very, very evident in the film. And just again, on a slightly anecdotal note, the whole question of people wearing the keffiyeh comes from this period when the fez was seen as being part of the old Ottoman Empire kind of ruling class. And so you saw only, if you like, upper class, in inverted commas, people wearing the fez, and the keffiyeh was part of the revolution. And that's why you heard at the end that they banned the wearing of it. So it's very appropriate, I think, for us to wear the keffiyeh. There was one other one other anecdote that I wanted to just relay. Sorry for going on, but it's not a stream of consciousness, but it is kind of very heartfelt the way I look at this film, because I think it is a very significant film. As I've talked about Wingate, but the whole way in which the British behaved and the way in which the Commission, as I said, was another way of covering up things. But just one other element of the story. When I saw the film on the first occasion, the woman who played the principal woman lead in the story, and the guy, Thomas, do you remember him? The English guy who finished up saying, "I'm going to leave Palestine." Well, actually, Thomas was a real character, a real person, and he published his letters at the end of it. And the actor who played him in the film told the story at the end of the film that he'd left, he'd abandoned sort of British imperialism. He returned to Britain and joined the Communist Party, and then he wasn't quite satisfied with that, so he became an anarchist. So, there is hope, isn't there? But it's an interesting story, isn't it? That there were people who did have conscience and did have principles and could see what was happening. Forgive me for elements of personal contributions to the story, but I do think it's an extremely important film and a very valid one. And as I said, there were all sorts of things within it that were true and you can find documented and actual were part of the story. So very, very little, if you like, of it was fictionalized, other than perhaps some of the personalities of the children and the families. But all the incidents, everything that happened, it was really present there. So yeah.
Were the square frames, is that historical footage, or they just made it look like historical footage?
I don't know.
You can
Okay.
answer.
Yeah, so archival footage was used, and we just see it. That's part of the reason she undertook this project, is because this new archival footage from the revolt was kind of released, and so yeah, it was unbelievable because it looks so good, right? But it's been restored in that way. But
So they must have colorized it, right?
Yes.
But that was all archival?
Yeah, it's all anything that looks not
Square.
related to the film,
Yeah.
or kind of more pixelated.
It was
or
different
archival
format.
footage.
Yeah, I mean, and the amazing thing is it was actually filmed in Palestine, apart from at the end, which, was sort of from late 23, and you can imagine things became difficult. So they then concluded the film in Jordan when they finished shooting it, but some of it was shot in Palestine. I think it said Bethlehem was one of the places that was mentioned around that area.
What was Jerusalem? I mean, what stood in the location for Jerusalem? No, but okay, never mind. Sorry.
No, I don't. Sorry.
I probably answer that as well. I spent a lot of time researching this.
Okay.
I think if it looks like it's Palestine, it probably is Palestine, because as Bernard said, that Jordan, Anne-Marie was very, very stubborn that it had to be in Palestine, and Jordan was using a substitute. But it was actually parts of it were actually filmed during genocide, shockingly, and so obviously some of the long shots of Palestine. I think a lot of it is. I think most of it is filmed on location in Palestine, which is quite remarkable. Sorry, I read too much about this one.
No. It's an exchange. It's not a monologue.
I've got a question then. Would you? I was struck by what I've read from the Nakba and what the Ergun and the Haganah and the kind of tactics that they used to clear the villages. I was actually. It's almost like you could, the British were doing in this film, you could kind of, put the Zionist militias in 48. So what do you think? Do you think the Zionists do you think they learned from this period almost?
I'd go even further back. Maybe this is an element of personal kind of view because I have Irish connections, but I think, they put it into practice in Ireland, and they burnt houses, they pulled people out, and they killed people and behaved in a similar way. And I think it was a continuity of imperialism. I mean, you could link it back to India and the way in which the British behaved in India too. With the revolt of the what I would call the uprising, they call the Sepoy mutiny or whatever. 1859 was it? I mean, that was a mass uprising, which is kind of wrongly portrayed in a lot of British history. So there was a continuity about the way in which intimidating, attacking people, fighting and terrorizing, and you can see that what's happening, in my view, what's happening in Gaza is like that written large, and you saw it during the Intifadas, and you saw it in the attack on places like Jenin and other places. That the similar kinds of thing of human shields, of reprisal attacks, of interventions of that kind. I think. Sorry if I maybe upset somebody, but I think that's British imperialism.
Excellent film. It brings the focus right back to Britain,
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, it's without
that's
a
where it should be, and that's that's how people should know about it. Because what's happened in the past and is going on now is Britain behind it all. And I just want to add to what you're saying, that the police who were employed in Palestine, during those times, they were taken to Malaya, to put down the people in Malaya. So there's so many connections,
Yeah.
that need to be exposed.
Yeah, I mean, there's a story which might sound humorous, but it isn't really, and that is that they, Black and Tans that I was talking about, they initially were recruited into what they called Palestine Gendarmerie. So they were kind of autonomous from the police force on the one hand, and also from the military, but then they were incorporated into the Palestine police force. And you know, the people like there was a Jewish police force, which was kind of a Zionist police force, which was worked with the settlement areas, and there was a man in charge in Jerusalem called Duffy, and he was renowned for being able to inflict punishment on people without leaving any marks or any signs of having done it. It's alleged that the expression "duffing people up" came from that, but certainly kind of that was, you know, the Israeli police force and so on learned all of those. So there's a continuity right the way through, as you say, and in other areas of the empire of Britain.
It's very powerful to see the sequence at the end with the bagpipes. It's just.
Yeah, it's a very Palestinian image. I mean, you know, if you will, they had their own scouts in Palestine who were not kind of part of the Baden-Powell type, you know, nonsense that we have here. And they had, sorry.
Inevitably, for me, it just brings back that history of internal repression of other languages and other cultures that were on rich soil.
Yeah, I just, sorry, going back slightly at a tangent. I mean, Wingate was an ideological Zionist himself. I mean, it wasn't just that he was there doing a job for the British Empire. I mean, as you heard, he sort of quoted the Bible in terms of justifying his position, and he was an Arabic speaker too. So, you know, there was all sorts of kind of different elements within the British. I mean, there was allegedly a kind of what they called a camel corps, which were people inside the British civil servant who were more sympathetic. And I think in a way you see that amongst some of the MPs in the Tories, ironically, who people like Kit Malthouse, who is more critical of what's happening now than some of the Labour MPs. And of course, when Keir Starmer said that the Labour Party was Zionist and had always been, in a sense he was right, because right the way through from pre-Balfour in 1915, 1916, the Labour Party produced the document with what they called the war aims, and the war aims were what they wanted to see coming out of a conclusion of the war with Germany or with the Ottoman Empire. And they incorporated a Zionist perspective within that. And subsequently, the Labour Party held that position right the way through, and of course it still holds that position today. So it's not the case, if you like, that an authentic anti-Zionist perspective within British politics emanates from within the Labour Party. There were few Labour MPs that were critical of that. There's another part of the story which is kind of how I see it, but you know, people may disagree, and I'm open to being criticised on that. And that is, I think, one of the disorientating things when you come to 1948 and Nakba is actually that the Soviet Union supported the establishment of Israel also. They saw it as an anti-imperialist kind of move because there were sections of the Zionists, particularly Jabotinsky and others, were sort of saying, you know, we're not going to align with the British in the war. We are fighting against the British as much as we are fighting against the Arab peoples. And so, you know, that was kind of a view. And I think that to some extent that disorientated and disarmed an anti-imperialist perspective developing amongst people critical of what happened for a period of time. It changed in the mid-50s, but certainly I think it was there at the time of the Nakba 48.
Just what was mentioned earlier about the role of the British. I found, I don't know what you think about it, but I found that it was a conscious decision by Anne-Marie to kind of almost ignore, because the settlers and Zionism and Zionist organisation are only referred to. We don't really see them. It's positioned as Palestine versus Britain. Do you think that was a conscious decision by Anne-Marie, and what do you think she achieved by doing that? To kind of, as was mentioned, I see it as maybe to highlight the role of Britain's complicity. Is there other things you think she was trying to do?
I would argue that was the right thing to do, because I think that reflected the real balance of forces in terms of the capacity to impose will, if you like, on what was happening. And as I said, the British armed forces were colossal in terms of their disposition in Palestine, and all the way through. I mean, what happened to the Palestinians was this thing about obviously the seizure of land and the development of that. But as the film illustrated, things like the wages that were paid to Palestinian Arab workers and to Jewish workers in Palestine by the British differentiated. It differentiated between men and women, and then differentiated between Jews and Palestinians, and within that, Palestinian men and women, Jewish men and women, and so on. And the whole sort of discriminatory practice. And at the very beginning, the showing of the finding the arms at the docks, all of that was absolutely true. There were many things that happened that, in my view, dislocated the capacity of Palestine to develop its economy and so on. Like, for example, the way in which, as I said before the film, the British kind of gave permission to Zionist employers, and they were, to set up the electricity company, to set up these monopolies that actually meant that the kind of economy was kind of structured around them and dependent on them, and also imposing heavier tariffs on companies that were predominantly Palestinian owned and so on. And there are books on this. I mean, a book by Barbara Smith called The Roots of Separation, which is a very interesting book about the way economically this, I think, you could argue, dislocated the way in which Palestinian society developed, because it robbed the farmers of their land, and then going to find work, they were confronted in the cities by Jewish employers operating a policy that the Zionists promoted, which was to say that Jewish employers should only employ Jewish workers. And the organizations of trade unions, as they were called, the Histrodot and so on, endorsed that. And actually, there were examples of cases where Jewish and Arab Palestinian workers were trying to improve their wages and took strike action, and the Jewish workers did a deal with the employers and went back to work and left the Palestinians out. There are all sorts of, every fabric of life was impacted by the way in which this was conducted, and the consent and the license that was given. So I think, as it were, pinning the tail on the imperial British donkey is the right thing to do. I think that expresses correctly the actual balance of forces that existed.
But that changed, obviously, over time as the Irgun pushed the British out. So the power shifted.
I wouldn't say the British were pushed out. I think the British Empire was collapsing. By the end of the Second World War, British imperialism started to collapse in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. During the First World War, the British couldn't have sustained themselves in the First World War without massive subvention from the United States. If you read the cabinet papers at the time, they were talking about, getting loans from America, and without those loans, they couldn't have sustained the war. And they were also very anxious about what was happening in Ireland, because the Easter Rising and the development and expansion of the nationalist struggle in Ireland threatened to tie down troops in Ireland and thereby put them in a difficult position in other parts of the globe that they were looking at. So, right the way through, I think, obviously I stand to be corrected or challenged, but I think British imperialism was on a decline from the early part of the 20th century right the way through. So when you got to the late 1940s, they couldn't keep it up. they had to, you know, from their point of view, they had to leave. And you also had Indian independence around that time, 48 or so. You had Irish reasserting their independence, if you like, in the late 1940s. And of course, you had the beginning of the other struggles, which also had emanated from the early part of the 20th century, like Indian independence movement, like the African National Congress, which had a different name in that early part. But these were all movements that were developing, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggles. And Britain didn't have the capacity, without being able to actually utilize forces, for example, from India, you know, literally thousands and thousands in the First World War, fighting in Europe and fighting elsewhere. Without them, you know, Britain is not big. Its capacity to hold forth on those sorts of things was reduced. So I wouldn't say that the British were forced out by the Zionist organisations. I think they were confronted with the reality that the British Empire was not capable of sustaining the position that they were in, and left. And you know, then you had the vote of the United Nations on partition, and it's you know, it's interesting. I think that you know, in the vote on partition, that clearly the Americans were critical in actually pushing that through, and America had taken an interest. Indeed, there was a time in the early 1920s, at the end of the First World War, when some Palestinians wanted the Americans to have the mandate rather than the British, because they thought that that might be lead more quickly to an independence, because President Woodrow Wilson had kind of, you know, claimed to be in favour of self-determination. Again, an interesting anecdote. The Soviet Revolution was 1917. They came out and actually exposed all the secret negotiations that the British had been involved in with Sykes-Picot and all of that, and you know, revealed that. And they had put out a statement before Woodrow Wilson saying that they supported the right of nations to self-determination and for independence. So when we come back to 48, I think it was more a conclusion of the decline of the British Empire.